He had ended wars with fewer words. Marco Valenti sat at the head of a polished conference table, surrounded by men who measured their breathing to his silence. Glass walls reflected tailored suits, steel nerves, and a future worth billions. Contracts lay open. A deal that would shift power across borders waited for his signature. Then his phone vibrated. Once. Marco did not usually look at his phone during negotiations. The world waited for him, not the other way around. But something, instinct perhaps, made his fingers still. His gaze lowered. One glance, that was all it took, and the room changed, as though she was unguarded, as though she was not his. Something ancient and violent stirred behind Marco's eyes. Not rage, not yet. Something colder. Something that calculated damage before emotion could soften it. He closed the file in front of him. The men around the table froze. Marco Valenti stood. Without explanation, he ended the meeting, the deal, the future they had all come to secure. Millions evaporated in the space of a breath. No one argued, no one dared, because they recognized the stillness in his movements. That stillness meant blood had already been priced. Across the city, Maria Esteban stood in a quiet hallway outside a conference room, reviewing tomorrow's schedule on her tablet. Her life ran on order, on preparation, on control earned the hard way. She did not believe in chaos. She had survived too much of it already. Her phone rang. Marco Valenti. She answered without hesitation. And the voice on the other end was not the one she knew. It was sharp, precise, unyielding. 3 words fell like a blade. Delete that photo. Now. This was not a request, not a suggestion. It was a command stripped of professionalism, stripped of distance. It crossed a line neither of them had named, but both had carefully respected. Maria did not raise her voice. She did not apologize. She did not rush to comply. She asked why. And in doing so, she did the one thing no one else in Marco Valenti's world ever did. She refused him. It came from survival. Maria had been raised by a grandmother who believed endurance was quieter than complaint. A woman who taught her that needing powerful people came at a cost. Maria learned early to be capable, self-sufficient, untouchable by chaos. She worked her way through university. She mastered organization like a weapon. Schedules, logistics, contingencies. Order became her shield. So when she accepted the position as executive assistant to Marco Valenti, she believed she was stepping into structure. Not danger. What she had not known, what no resume ever revealed, was that Marco Valenti was not just a CEO. He was a myth wrapped in restraint, the head of the Valenti family, an old-world syndicate that ruled through loyalty and fear, a man who had inherited power through betrayal and blood, after watching his older brother die for loving too openly. Marco had learned the lesson well. Love was a liability. Proximity was a weapon. And Maria Esteban had walked straight into the center of his life without flinching. From her first day, she had disrupted his discipline. She did not tremble. She did not lower her eyes. She spoke carefully, but never timidly. She anticipated problems before they surfaced. She organized his empire one decision at a time. Marco told himself she was efficient, valuable, replaceable. But the photo proved the lie. Because the idea of another man touching her, claiming space that Marco had never allowed himself to take, had made him reckless. And recklessness, in his world, got people killed. Maria stood still, phone pressed to her ear, heart steady, spine straight. She did not know yet that rival families were already watching. She did not know that rumors would spread by morning. She did not know that one photograph had just marked her as leverage. All she knew was this. She had refused the most dangerous man in the room. And Marco Valenti had never been refused before. Because once Marco Valenti claimed something as his, he did not let it go. Maria Esteban did not hang up immediately. She stood in the quiet hallway long after the call ended. The glow of her phone dimming against polished stone. Her heartbeat did not race. Her hands did not shake. Control had been learned too early in her life for panic to take root now. Fear was loud. She had learned to survive by being silent. Maria was raised in a neighborhood where noise meant weakness. where survival depended on finishing what you started and never explaining yourself to people who would use your honesty against you. Her grandmother taught her that stability was built, not wished for, that relying on powerful people meant giving them permission to break you. So Maria became capable. She worked while others slept, studied while others partied, learned how systems worked so no one could trap her inside them. Control was not arrogance to her, it was armor. When she walked into Marco Valenti's office for the first time, she did not see a king. She saw a structure, glass walls, immaculate lines, a man whose entire world ran on precision and silence. She understood that language immediately. It was the same one she spoke, only sharpened into something dangerous. Marco Valenti noticed her because she did not perform fear. Men twice her size lowered their voices around him. Executives chose words like offerings. Maria spoke like a professional, direct, calm, exact. She organized his schedule in a way that closed vulnerabilities he had not realized were open. She flagged risks before they became problems. She moved through his world as if she belonged there, not because she claimed power, but because she respected it. Marco told himself this was efficiency, nothing more. But efficiency did not explain why he watched the clock when she worked late. It did not explain why gifts arrived under her name, bonuses framed as performance rewards, privileges disguised as logistics. It did not explain why her safety reports were approved immediately while others waited. He never touched her. He never crossed a line. He simply adjusted the world around her so it bent more easily, and Maria noticed. She noticed the extra car when she left late, the subtle changes in security routes, the way Marco's gaze lingered half a second longer than necessary, never enough to accuse, always enough to feel. Still, she said nothing. Boundaries were safe. Boundaries were survival. Maria walked back into her office and closed the door. She opened her tablet and reviewed her calendar as if nothing had changed, because acknowledging the weight of that command, delete that photo, would give it power. And Maria Esteban did not give power freely. What she did not know was how rare her refusal was. Marco Valenti ruled a world where defiance was punished quickly and publicly, where loyalty was absolute and consequences were permanent. He had been shaped by betrayal, hardened by blood, taught that love was the first weakness enemies would exploit. When his brother died, Marco learned a brutal truth. Anything you care about will be used against you, so he had buried care beneath discipline, desire beneath control. He built a life where proximity was measured and emotional distance was enforced. Until Maria. She was not supposed to matter, but she did. Not because she was fragile, because she was not. Because she stood in his space without asking permission and made it stronger. Because she did not need his protection, and somehow that made him want to give it anyway. When she refused him on the phone, something shifted. Not anger, recognition. For the first time in years, Marco Valenti realized he had miscalculated. Not the enemy, not the risk, but himself. Maria did not delete the photo. She did not post it again either. She returned to work the next morning exactly on time. Dressed impeccably, her posture steady, her expression neutral. She did not bring up the call. She did not apologize. She waited. And Marco noticed that too. Because power did not frighten her, because she had lived her life never expecting anyone to save her. And men like Marco Valenti, they noticed women who did not ask to be claimed. They noticed women who stood their ground. They noticed women who could ruin them simply by being seen. This was no longer about a photograph. It was about two people who had learned control in different ways. And what happens when control meets something it cannot command? Would you have stood your ground like Maria, or protected yourself by backing down? Nothing was said. That was the first change. After the call, after the refusal, after the photograph that should have detonated consequences, silence settled between them like a held breath. Meetings continued. Emails were sent. Calendars updated. The machine of Marco Valenti's world did not slow, but nothing felt neutral anymore. Marco did not raise his voice again. He did not issue another command. He did not ask about the photo, the man, or the night it was taken. Instead, he retreated into immaculate professionalism, the kind that looked flawless from the outside and unbearable from within. Maria noticed the distance immediately, not because he ignored her, but because he did not. Every interaction was precise, controlled, impeccably timed. He spoke to her only when necessary, but when he did, his attention was absolute. No wandering glances, no impatience, no warmth either. It was restraint sharpened into discipline. And restraint, Maria knew, was not indifference. They worked later nights now, not because they had to, but because neither chose to leave first. Glass-walled offices reflected city lights and quiet tension. Papers slid across desks with careful hands. Coffee appeared exactly when it was needed. Their proximity was constant, unavoidable, and completely untouched. Everything was professional, but nothing was empty. Maria felt it in the pauses between instructions, in the way Marco's gaze tracked her movement without ever settling too long, in the gifts that continued to arrive, this time subtler. A chair adjusted to her posture, a schedule rearranged to spare her exhaustion, a security update issued without explanation, protection disguised as logistics, care hidden inside control. Maria told herself not to imagine meaning where none was offered. She had survived long enough to know better, but even she could not ignore how aware she had become of him, of the sound of his footsteps, of the way the room recalibrated when he entered, of how silence stretched tighter when their hands brushed accidentally and neither acknowledged it. They did not speak of boundaries. They lived inside them. Marco told himself this was necessary. He told himself distance would solve the problem, that returning to structure would restore balance, that desire, once starved of oxygen, would extinguish itself. But desire was not the danger. Attachment was. And attachment had already taken root. He found himself watching Maria more than the data on his screens, listening for her voice before she spoke, anticipating her needs before she articulated them, and resenting himself for how easily he did it. He did not touch her, he did not claim her, but his world bent around her anyway. In Marco Valenti's world, proximity was never accidental, which meant this, whatever it was, had already crossed into dangerous territory. One evening, long past sunset, Maria gathered her things to leave. Marco was still working. She hesitated at the door, then stopped. She turned back, not to confess, not to challenge, simply to speak. She mentioned a potential scheduling conflict, a minor detail, something inconsequential. But Marco looked up immediately, fully present, as if he had been waiting for her to say anything at all. They held each other's gaze for one heartbeat too long, then two, and in that moment, everything they refused to name pressed against the space between them, unspoken, unclaimed, undeniable. Maria left without another word. Marco remained where he was, hands still, jaw tight, because acknowledging the truth would require action, and action would mean risk. This was no longer about restraint, it was about choice, because when two people pretend neutrality while feeling everything, the tension does not fade, it sharpens. Jealousy did not announce itself. It did not shout or threaten or demand explanations. It waited, it watched. And then it moved with precision. Marco Valenti told himself he had regained control. That silence had restored order. That distance had returned him to the disciplined man his world required him to be. From the outside, it looked convincing. From the inside, it was a lie. Because control was not the absence of emotion. It was the constant labor of containment. And jealousy, once awakened, did not ask for permission to exist. The gala resurfaced in fragments. A donor mentioned it in passing. A board member praised the optics. A junior executive joked about how relaxed Maria had looked. Relaxed. That word lodged itself where it did not belong. Maria had never looked relaxed around him. She was calm, composed, capable, but relaxed. Unguarded, luminous, unaware of danger. That version of her had existed in someone else's orbit, and Marco had seen it. Marco did not summon Maria. He did not interrogate her. Instead, he watched. He noticed the way her posture tightened whenever that gala was referenced, the way her gaze stayed level, steady, refusing shame. He noticed that she had not deleted the photo, but she had not shared it again either. Restraint, intentional, just like his. It should have satisfied him. It did not. Because jealousy was not about possession. It was about the unbearable awareness that something precious could exist beyond your control. One evening, after a late strategy meeting, Maria gathered her notes and turned to leave. Marco spoke before he intended to. Not a command, a question, measured, controlled, dangerous in its calm. Maria stopped. She turned. And for the first time since the phone call, she did not shield herself behind professionalism. She met his gaze directly, and she asked him why it mattered. That single question fractured the room. Because Marco Valenti could justify violence. He could justify surveillance, retaliation, even death. But he could not justify this without telling the truth. Marco felt the old rules tightening around his throat, the rules that had kept him alive, the rules that said love was weakness, and weakness was fatal. He could retreat. He could end the conversation. He could restore the distance. Instead, he answered, not fully, but enough. He told her it mattered because recklessness invited enemies, because appearances were weapons, because her safety was not separate from his decisions. All true, and all incomplete. Maria listened without interrupting, then she did something unexpected. She did not argue, she did not apologize. She said quietly, evenly, that she would not be controlled without explanation, that her life was not a chess piece, that if he wanted something from her, he would have to ask, not command. This was not rebellion. This was consent being demanded, and Marco Valenti had built his empire on taking. He had not built it on asking. Jealousy tightened its grip, not as anger but as fear, fear that he had already crossed a line he could not retreat from, fear that if he admitted the truth, that the idea of another man touching her made him reckless, he would confirm the very weakness his enemies waited for. So he did what he had always done. He controlled the damage. He ended the conversation, professionally, politely, coldly. But something irreversible had already happened. Because Maria now knew. Not the full truth, but enough to feel it. That night, rival families noticed the fracture, a canceled deal, a visible distraction, a pattern emerging where none had existed before. Whispers moved faster than facts. Rumors took shape. The Valenti boss has developed a weakness, and weaknesses were invitations. Maria did not know any of this yet. All she knew was that Marco Valenti had looked at her like a man standing at the edge of something he could not afford to fall into, and she had refused to step back, because jealousy, once revealed, could not be buried again. And in Marco Valenti's world, anything revealed would be tested. After the question that was never fully answered, Marco Valenti retreated. Not in anger, not in punishment, but in the only way he knew how to survive, professionally. The days that followed were immaculate. Schedules tightened, meetings shortened, decisions executed with ruthless efficiency. Marco's world returned to perfect alignment, as if emotion had been surgically removed from the system. Maria felt the change immediately, not because she was excluded, but because she was insulated. Her access remained intact. Her authority untouched, her responsibilities respected. But the atmosphere shifted. Conversations ended sooner. Eye contact broke faster. Where tension had once hummed beneath the surface, there was now a sterile calm. Distance. Carefully measured, deliberately enforced. Marco told himself this was necessary. That proximity had created vulnerability. That vulnerability had invited attention, and attention in his world always drew blood. So he did the responsible thing. He put glass walls back between them. He approved Maria's proposals without comment. He signed off on her recommendations immediately. He ensured her safety increased quietly, new protocols, new drivers, new routes. Never explained, never discussed. Protection without closeness, care without confession. To anyone watching, it looked like professionalism restored. To Maria, it felt like loss she was not allowed to name. She did not confront him. She did not demand clarity. She accepted the distance with the same composure she had always relied on. But silence, when shared by two people who knew its weight, did not empty the space. It filled it. Late nights returned, but now they worked on opposite sides of the glass. Maria could see Marco through the transparent walls of his office, shoulders tense, jaw set, focus absolute. He never looked up when she passed, and yet she knew he knew she was there, because the moment she left, his work slowed. Maria found herself reading into details she had trained herself to ignore. The absence of casual glances, the way gifts continued, but stripped of warmth, a book placed on her desk without a note, a chair replaced to support her posture better. Everything thoughtful, nothing personal. She told herself this was safer. She told herself this was what she wanted. But denial did not stop the ache of being seen and then deliberately unseen. Marco suffered too. The distance did not calm him, it sharpened his awareness. He noticed every second she was not within reach, every risk he could not immediately assess, every moment she existed beyond his line of sight, and he hated himself for it, because attachment was exactly what he had sworn never to allow again. He had watched love get his brother killed. He had built his empire on the bones of that lesson, so when desire began to blur into something deeper, something that threatened his control, he did what he always did. He buried it beneath discipline, but discipline did not erase instinct. One evening, Marco nearly crossed the office to stop Maria as she prepared to leave. His body moved before his mind caught up. He stopped himself inches from the door, because calling her back would mean admitting what distance had failed to kill, and he was not ready for that truth. This was confession without permission to act. Both of them knew something existed. Neither would name it. And in that refusal, the tension did not dissolve. It matured. Because restraint, when prolonged, does not weaken desire. It concentrates it. The act closes with a quiet inevitability. Glass walls could separate their bodies. They could not separate what had already been recognized. Distance did not last. It never did. Because distance was a tactic, and tactics failed when instinct overruled strategy. Maria noticed it first in the smallest detail. A meeting ran long. Night pressed against the windows. Security protocols were reviewed with unusual precision. Then, without ceremony, a small black case appeared on her desk. Unlabeled, unremarkable, impossible to ignore. Inside was a necklace, not ornate, not flashy, minimal, custom-made. The kind of object that did not seek attention but commanded permanence. Integrated into the clasp was a discrete security feature, untraceable, encrypted, tied into a private network few people even knew existed. Protection, framed as practicality. But nothing about it was neutral. Marco did not present it to her personally, he did not explain it. But Maria understood immediately, this was not a gift. It was a marker, not ownership, acknowledgement. She wore it. Not because she felt claimed, but because she chose to accept the meaning beneath it. And Marco noticed. The following days shifted again, this time with deliberate balance. The distance softened, not erased, but reshaped. Conversations lengthened by a sentence. Instructions carried an undercurrent of care. His gaze no longer avoided her. It anchored briefly, then released. Language changed too, not overtly, but subtly. Your schedule, your security, your time. Possessive words wrapped in professional tone. And always consent. Marco never touched her. Never closed the distance without invitation. But the world adjusted around her with unmistakable intent. Claiming without crossing the final line. Maria felt the weight of it, not as pressure, but as gravity. She understood power dynamics. She had lived around them her entire life. And what Marco was doing now was not domination. It was restraint with direction. She tested it. Quietly, she adjusted her schedule without prior notice. Marco noticed immediately, but did not correct her. Instead, he asked if the change served her better. She challenged a decision in a closed meeting. He listened, then deferred. Not because he had to, because he trusted her. That trust was the most dangerous thing he had ever given anyone. In Marco Valenti's world, trust was currency, and he was spending it on her. One evening, as they stood alone in the glass corridor between offices, the city glowing beneath them, their hands brushed. Not accidentally, not urgently, intentionally. Maria did not pull away. Marco did not close his fingers around hers. They let the contact exist for a single heartbeat, then separated. Enough to acknowledge, not enough to claim. Because crossing that line would turn implication into inevitability, and Marco needed certainty before he allowed himself that fall. This was emotional ownership preceding physical intimacy, not control, commitment. Maria felt it too. She knew the necklace marked her, not as property, but as protected, as chosen, as someone whose safety now mattered enough to alter the behavior of a man who had built his life on isolation. She also knew the cost. Because being marked in Marco Valenti's world did not make you safer. It made you visible. The act closes with a quiet, ominous truth. Symbolic claims were still claims, and once made, they could not be undone. Power was safest when it stayed behind closed doors. Marco Valenti understood this better than anyone. Private loyalty could be controlled. Private affection could be contained. But the moment something personal became visible, truly visible, it stopped being a secret and started being leverage. A high-profile international charity auction. Cameras, diplomats, rivals disguised as benefactors. The kind of event where reputation mattered more than truth, and smiles were sharpened into weapons. Marco arrived precisely on time. Maria arrived at his side. That alone was enough, not because she had never attended such events before, but because this time she was not positioned behind him, not 2 steps back, not managing logistics from the shadows. She walked beside him, equal pace, calm posture. The necklace rested at her throat, subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable to anyone trained to see markers of significance. Eyes followed them. Whispers adjusted, because Marco Valenti did not bring people into his public orbit without purpose, and purpose in his world always came with consequence. Maria felt the attention like a change in air pressure. She did not shrink from it. She did not seek it either. She moved with quiet confidence, engaging when necessary, observing when not. She belonged, and that fact unsettled the room. The antagonist did not reveal himself directly. He never did. Instead, he appeared in fragments, lingering glances, deliberate proximity, questions framed as compliments. He tested the boundaries without crossing them. Yet, a rival approached Maria while Marco was momentarily engaged elsewhere, polite, charming, curious. He commented on her intelligence, her composure. He asked how long she had been working so closely with Marco Valenti. Maria answered evenly, professionally, but she did not step back. Marco noticed. From across the room, his attention snapped into focus. Not explosive, not obvious, but precise, calculating. He adjusted his position without haste, closing the distance just enough to signal presence. Ownership without announcement, protection without spectacle. The rival smiled, because now he had confirmation. The Valenti boss had a weakness. Maria was not the liability. The visibility was. Throughout the evening, Marco's composure never cracked. He negotiated, he donated, he smiled when required. But every decision now accounted for one variable that had not existed before: her safety. Maria, for her part, proved herself. When a delicate conversation threatened to spiral, she intervened smoothly, redirecting attention, diffusing tension with intellect rather than charm. When questioned about her role, she answered with clarity and authority, leaving no doubt that she was not decoration. The room adjusted to her, and that adjustment was noted by allies, by enemies, by those who measured power not in titles, but in attachment. By the end of the night, rumors were already moving. Not facts, interpretations, stories shaped to wound. The Valenti boss has grown distracted. The Valenti boss brings his heart into public view, and hearts, in this world, were targets. As they left, Marco placed his hand lightly at the small of Maria's back, not to guide, not to restrain, to signal. She leaned into the contact, just enough to acknowledge it. Cameras caught nothing explicit, but intent was unmistakable. The act closes with a warning delivered softly. Love had not yet been declared, but it had been seen, and once seen, it could be hunted. Visibility changes everything. Once Maria Esteban was seen beside Marco Valenti, not as an accessory, not as a shadow, but as a presence. There was no returning to how things had been. Security briefings grew longer, risk assessments more frequent. Marco's inner circle adjusted, not because he ordered them to, but because they sensed a shift in gravity. And at the center of it stood Maria, not shielded, not sidelined, invited. For the first time, Marco did not ask her to prepare the room and step out. He asked her to stay. The meeting was small. Trusted men only, maps spread across the table. Financial data layered with intelligence reports. The kind of room where decisions reshaped lives far beyond the walls. Maria understood the weight immediately. This was not courtesy, it was elevation. Marco spoke first, outlining the threat with surgical calm. Rival families circling, reputation probes, subtle pressure designed to expose fractures. He spoke as a strategist, not a tyrant. Then he turned to Maria and asked for her assessment. Men who had known Marco Valenti for decades watched in silence as he invited someone new, not by blood, not by oath, into the core of his decision-making. Maria did not hesitate. She did not posture. She analyzed. She pointed out patterns others dismissed as coincidence. She reframed intimidation as messaging. She identified vulnerabilities not in security, but in narrative. Reputation, she explained, was the real battlefield, and it could be defended. Her insight shifted the room, not because it was gentle, because it was precise. Marco listened, fully. When she finished, he did not correct her. He agreed, and in that single gesture, something fundamental changed. Attraction transformed into respect. Desire could be denied. Respect could not. From that point on, Maria was no longer briefed after decisions were made. She helped shape them. Marco trusted her judgment openly, assigned her authority without qualifiers, backed her calls without explanation. Not because she was close to him, because she was right. The power dynamic recalibrated quietly but irreversibly. Maria felt it too. She was no longer balancing on the edge of his world. She stood inside it. And with that access came understanding. She saw the cost of his restraint. The careful way he chose calculated justice over brutality. The discipline it took to rule without surrendering to impulse. She also saw the danger. Because proximity to power did not just grant protection, it painted a target. Late nights returned, this time side by side. Papers spread between them, coffee cooling untouched. Their conversations grew longer, deeper, edged with meaning that still refused to name itself. They spoke of risk, of consequence, of the line between control and care. Still, no touch, still, no confession. But something steadier had taken its place. Partnership. Marco no longer adjusted the world around Maria. He adjusted it with her. And that distinction mattered, because when danger came, and it would, she would not be shielded in ignorance. She would be prepared. This was no longer a story of a powerful man and his assistant. It was the beginning of two strategists standing on the same side of the board. Danger did not arrive loudly. It never did. In Marco Valenti's world, violence announced itself only after intention had already been set. The real threat came first as pressure, subtle, persistent, designed to test limits before crossing them. Anonymous tips surfaced in the media. Financial journalists asked carefully worded questions. Security feeds showed unfamiliar vehicles lingering just long enough to be noticed. And always, the focus circled back to Maria. Not by name, by implication. Marco recognized the pattern immediately. This was not an attack on him. It was an examination of his attachment. He increased security without debate. Routes changed daily. Meetings relocated. Maria was never alone, not obviously, but always protected. She noticed. And this time, she did not pretend not to. She confronted him, not emotionally, but strategically. She pointed out the inefficiency, the visibility, the way heightened protection itself signaled vulnerability. Marco listened. Because she was right. But listening did not quiet the instinct roaring beneath his restraint. For the first time in years, Marco Valenti faced a threat he could not neutralize with force or foresight. Because the variable was human. Because loving her, acknowledging her place in his life, had turned her into a target. One night, The warning sharpened. A message delivered without signature. A photograph taken without consent. Maria entering a building, time-stamped, zoomed, precise. Proof of access, proof of intent. Marco did not raise his voice. He did not rage. He went still. Plans shifted instantly. Allies activated. Retaliation outlined, but not executed. Because before he could strike, Marco made a different decision. He offered Maria an exit. Not as dismissal, as protection. He told her, carefully, honestly, that she could leave. Disappear into a life untouched by his wars. That he would fund it, secure it, erase every trace of her connection to him. That he would not follow. Because this was the first time Marco Valenti relinquished control voluntarily. Maria listened, then she refused. Not impulsively, not defiantly. She refused with clarity. She told him she understood the risk. That walking away would not erase what had already been seen. That she would not be safer by pretending she had never mattered. And most importantly, that she would not allow fear to decide her life for her. Love was being chosen, not demanded, not enforced, chosen. Marco did not argue. He did not command. He accepted. And in that acceptance, the final barrier fell. They stood closer than they ever had, not touching, not yet, but no longer pretending distance could save them. From that moment on, Maria was no longer collateral. She was a partner, and Marco Valenti would defend her, not by hiding her away, but by standing with her in full view. The act ends on inevitability, because once love was chosen openly, war was no longer avoidable. Choice is heavier than fate. Fate arrives without asking. Choice demands responsibility. Marco Valenti does not argue with Maria's decision to stay. He accepts it. And that acceptance changes the air between them more than any declaration could have. Because until now, everything between them had existed in implication, in restraint, in carefully controlled silence. But choice, mutual, deliberate choice, removes the illusion of neutrality. From this moment forward, everything would be intentional. They meet late that night in a secured residence overlooking the city. No guards in the room, no observers. Just distance enough to speak honestly without performance. Marco Valenti does not allow witnesses to his uncertainty. But Maria is not a witness. She is the reason. He tells her, without embellishment, without dominance, that staying will make her life harder. That danger will not fade quickly. That loving him means living inside consequence. He does not ask for reassurance. He does not promise safety. He offers truth. And Maria answers with the same. She tells him she will not be managed like a fragile asset. That if she stays as an equal. That fear has already taken enough from her life, and she will not let it dictate her future. This is not seduction. This is consent forged under pressure. Marco agrees, not verbally, decisively. He hands her access, codes, authority, visibility that cannot be revoked without dismantling his own system. He integrates her fully, not as protection, but as presence. This is the moment their bond becomes undeniable. Still, no touch. The restraint remains, but it no longer feels like denial. It feels like reverence. They stand close, close enough to feel heat, close enough to sense how thin the final boundary has become. Marco's dominance is there, but softened, recalibrated, waiting for invitation rather than imposing itself. Maria does not step back. She steps closer, not into his arms, into his space, and he allows it. Marco Valenti does not allow proximity without purpose. This proximity is a promise, a silent agreement that what comes next will not be rushed, not taken, not forced by circumstance. It will be chosen. Outside, the city hums, unaware that a war has shifted course, not through violence, but through alignment. The act closes with a quiet certainty. They have chosen each other, not as escape, not as fantasy, but as commitment. And from this point on, restraint is no longer about fear. It is about timing. Intimacy did not arrive as hunger. It arrived as relief. There was no urgency now, no chase, no need to prove anything. They had chosen each other in the only way that mattered. The room was dim, lit by the city beyond the windows. Marco Valenti stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, every instinct trained not to take what had not been offered. Power still lived in him, but it was tempered, disciplined, waiting. Maria felt the shift immediately. This was not the tension of denial. This was the tension of permission waiting to be spoken. Marco did not reach for her. He spoke instead. Not of desire, but of truth. He acknowledged what he had tried to control, what he had feared naming. He admitted that watching her live outside his orbit had undone him, not because she belonged to him, but because she mattered. Because the idea of losing her, not to death, but to distance, had been unbearable. It was not a declaration of ownership. It was a confession of vulnerability. Maria listened without interruption, then she answered. Not with reassurance, but with presence. She told him she had seen his restraint, that she had felt the care hidden inside control, that she had stayed not because she needed protection, but because she trusted the man who offered it, without demanding surrender. This was not dominance softened by affection. This was power choosing gentleness. Maria stepped closer, close enough that space itself disappeared. Marco did not move, not until she did. Her hand rested against his chest, not tentative, not rushed, an anchor, a decision. And only then did he respond, slowly, carefully, closing the distance with the same deliberation that defined everything he did. The first kiss was not desperate. It was inevitable, unhurried. A release earned through patience rather than urgency. Marco's touch was reverent, as though he understood that intimacy was not conquest, but trust finally given shape. His dominance did not vanish, but it transformed, guided by consent, grounded in attention. Maria did not disappear inside him. She remained fully herself. And that was what made the union complete. The tension that had haunted every silence, every glance, every restrained moment finally dissolved. Not into chaos, but into calm. They stayed like that for a long moment, not rushing forward, not retreating, just breathing in the certainty of what had been built. This intimacy was not a reward. It was a consequence of choice, of respect, of two people who had refused shortcuts. Outside, the dangers of Marco's world still waited. Enemies still watched. Consequences had not vanished. But something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer standing alone. The act closes softly, because love, when earned this way, does not weaken power, it steadies it. Power does not disappear when love enters the room. It adapts. The threat was neutralized quietly, not with bloodshed splashed across headlines, not with bodies left as warnings, but with precision, with timing, with intelligence that left no space for retaliation. And Maria was part of it, not shielded, not hidden, present. She mapped narratives while Marco mapped moves. She identified pressure points where reputation could collapse without a single shot fired. She anticipated reactions before enemies believed themselves exposed. Together, they dismantled the threat piece by piece. Financial leverage here, legal consequences there, alliances fractured, secrets surfaced, not as rumors, but as documented truths. The rival family found itself isolated, weakened, forced into retreat without ever seeing the full shape of the hand that defeated them. Controlled violence replaced by calculated justice. Marco Valenti's world stabilized, not because fear ruled it, but because order had been restored. And Maria stood at the center of that order. For the first time, Marco allowed someone to see what remained when the doors closed. His home was not extravagant. It was quiet, purposeful. Clean lines softened by small human details. Books left unfinished. A kitchen used more than expected. Windows chosen for light rather than surveillance. Maria noticed everything. She saw the man behind the title, the cost of leadership, the loneliness he had normalized. And Marco, who had ruled empires without witness, allowed her to see him without armor. They developed routines, morning silence shared rather than endured, meals cooked together without urgency, conversations about the future that did not feel like strategy sessions. Power no longer isolated him, it anchored him. The necklace returned one evening, not as protection this time, but as memory. Marco held it between them, his movements unhurried. The symbol that once marked danger now marked continuity. He did not frame it as ownership. He framed it as choice. He asked, and Maria answered. Not with hesitation, but with certainty. There was no grand spectacle, no public announcement, just commitment, quiet, irrevocable, deeply intentional. Marriage was not presented as conquest or obligation. It was partnership formalized, a promise that what they had built would not fracture under pressure. Maria became fully integrated into Marco's world, not absorbed by it, not diminished by it, but reshaping it through presence, ethics, and competence. She did not soften him into weakness. She refined him into something stronger. She understands now that control had never been the enemy. Fear had been. And love, chosen freely, deliberately, had not destroyed power. It had disciplined it. Marco Valenti still ruled, but now he ruled with someone beside him who could challenge him, steady him, and remind him of the human cost behind every decision. The world did not fall when he loved. It adjusted, it bent. The story closes softly, with a city at peace beneath their window, with a future no longer dictated by fear, with two people who had chosen each other, not as escape, but as foundation. And for the first time in Marco Valenti's life, power was no longer something he carried alone, because empires can be rebuilt, but queens are never accidental. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps me bring you even more emotional, heartwarming stories filled with love, tension, and unforgettable moments. Stay tuned. More beautiful stories are on the way.